Welcome back. In this next section, we're going to be replacing the controls into the control compartment of the pump. In the event that the cable needs to be replaced, the following procedures will need to be followed. First, we'll need to remove the cable from the top housing. Then we'll need to remove the cable from the level sensor, and then we'll need to remove the cable from the control cover as well. To remove the cable from the top housing, we'll need to remove the electrical quick disconnect, or EQD. To do this, we'll have to loosen the liquid tight cord grip compression nut on the back side, loosen the screws that hold the insert in place, slide the cable up, and loosen the 6 set screws that hold the wires onto the insert. Once the insert's removed, we'll now be able to slide the EQD housing off the cable. We'll also be able to remove the dust cap from the cable, as well as the data tag. At this point, I'm going to want to remove the equalizer as well, so I'll take my diagonal cutters and clip the zip tie that holds it onto the cable. Remove that and set that to the side. Now at this point, I can pull the cable out of the top housing. Set the top housing aside for now. To remove the cable from the level sensor assembly, simply follow the procedures that Josh talked about in the level sensor repair portion of the video. To remove the split nut from the control cover, you'll need a pair of channel locks. Basically just clamp onto the split nut and back it out. Once the split nut's been removed, you can now pull the cable out. May be a little difficult to get out at first because we are using Loctite 598 to seal up the threads to keep them from corroding, but it should come out relatively easy. Before you reinstall the new cable, you'll first need to clean the threads. An M32 by 1.5 bottom tap will need to be used in order to clean the threads thoroughly. If you fail to clean the threads thoroughly, there could be plastic remaining in there from the previous split nut, which could cause the new split nut to strip when you try to insert it. You may want to turn it back and forth a little bit. Make sure you get the threads cleaned thoroughly. Recommend that you thread it all the way down until it bottoms out. Remove any debris that may remain in the cable entry area. The new cable will also have to be installed into the level sensor assembly, and you can do that as Josh described in the level sensor portion previously in the video. Now that we have prepped our casting, we're ready to install the cable into the control cover. I'll take my wires, feed them down through the cable entry area. I'm going to use Loctite 598. And I'm going to apply it generously right below the strain relief portion of the overmold. Don't be afraid to get too much. We want to make sure that the threads are evenly coated completely before we put the nut in. I'm going to take this, and now I'm just going to wiggle it around. Coat the threads thoroughly and evenly. Slip my cable down into the hole and take my new split nut and install it. These can be pretty difficult to install sometimes. So what I would recommend doing is getting it together. It's a right-hand thread. They're very easy to cross thread and strip. So what you probably want to do is turn it backwards very slowly until you feel the first two threads click, and then start to turn it forward clockwise, and it should thread right in. Tighten it as much as you can with your hands, and then grab your channel locks and finish tightening it the rest of the way. It's extremely important how the T portion of the cable is aligned. It must be aligned perpendicular to this side of the casting. It needs to be pointing away from the cable entry towards the other side of the control cover. If it's not pointing that way, if it's pointing this way or this way, it'll interfere with the top housing during removal and installation. The cable will try to turn as you're tightening it, so hold it firmly so it doesn't turn. Once you're done with that, you can wipe away any of the excess 598 that may have squeezed out. Now that we've replaced the cable, we're almost ready to reinstall the controls. Before we install the new control bracket, we want to make sure and install two new radial seals. So we're going to take our two radial seals, we're going to lubricate them up with Moly Coat 55 before we install them, or you can lubricate them after you install them, it doesn't matter. As long as you lubricate the O-rings with Moly Coat 55. All right, before I reinstall the control bracket, there's just one more thing that I'd like to do. I recommend that anytime you remove a flag terminal or a spade terminal from a connection, that you always replace it. So I'm going to clip these flag terminals off, and I'm going to replace them before I reinstall the control bracket. Grab 3 new flag terminals, flag terminal crimper, when installing flag terminals, it's extremely important that you use the proper crimper. A regular straight terminal crimper more than likely is going to damage standard flag terminals. So it's highly recommended that you have the specific tool required to crimp flag terminals. This crimper provides a double crimp on the wire or the conductor as well as the insulated portion of the wire. All right, now that we've got all the terminals replaced and the radial O-rings on and lubricated, we're now ready to install the control bracket. But before I install the control bracket, I want to make sure and put my ground wire back in because it's going to be at the very bottom of the control compartment. It's extremely difficult to get in there once the bracket's in place. So I'm going to grab my chassis screw that has the washer on it, grab my ground wire from the power cable. There's 3 holes in here. As you're looking at the pump from this orientation, there's one right here, there's one right here on the right side, and there's one right here on the left side. So there's 2 on the back side and 1 on the front side. The one that's on my left in the back side will be the appropriate run to put the ground screw into. Okay, now that the ground wire's been attached to the chassis, I can now install the control bracket. But before I stick it into the compartment, I want to make sure and put the two motor wires that go to the start switch on the terminals. The yellow wire goes to pin number 1. It's kind of important the way you orient them too on the bracket. You want to have the wires on the side that the contactors are on. Otherwise, if you put them in facing the other way, they're going to interfere with the wall inside the compartment, and it's going to be extremely difficult to get it in there as well as get the screws in place to secure it. Okay, yellow pin number 1, gray on pin number 3. Now I can set the bracket in place and secure it with the 2 screws. Using a 5/32 hex driver. This is a ball type hex driver. It should adhere or hold the screws to the tip. In some cases they get a little wallowed out when you remove them. If you can't get it to stick to it, these are stainless screws. A magnetic tip will not work. I recommend just putting a little bit of the moly coat or the silicone grease on the tip of your driver, and that'll help it stick on there a little better. All right. Once the bracket's secured with the 2 screws, we're now ready to wire it up. You have this card that we removed earlier. This has your wiring diagram on it. Doesn't matter what order you wire it up in, just as long as you get the wires into the correct locations. As you're installing the wires, I recommend that you give each one a tug just to make sure you have them securely in their location. The blue motor wire goes into 2T1. Give it a good tug. I didn't get it in there. That's why we always want to give it a good tug. Okay, that's in there now. The brown power cable, which is the one I called L1 control, redundant run and manual run earlier, goes into the A2 terminal of the contactor. Give that a good little tug. Okay. There again, you can do this in any order you want to. I typically do it the same way every time, but it doesn't matter. Like I said, as long as you get the wires in the appropriate location, that's all that really matters. There's actually a little hook back here underneath the control bracket, which you can put this red wire under, which is the red motor start wire. Attaches to the capacitor like so. And then the black motor wires right here, you can wrap that around and it slides right under that slot as well. And we're going to attach it to this butt splice that goes to the thermal protector. There again, always give your wires a good little tug. Okay. So that's in place. I'm going to just kind of tuck that down here and get it out of the way so it'll be nice and neat in there. This orange wire, as I said earlier, is for 120 volt applications only, so we're really not using it. So what we're going to do is we're going to terminate it in an unused set of contacts at 14 NO. Typically, I'll take this wire and wrap it around the blue, gray, and yellow wires a few times just to kind of bundle them up, keep them nice and neat and tight within the compartment. Put it up a few times. Okay. At this point, the easiest thing for me to do is grab it with a pair of needle nose because it is really tight in this compartment. Get it into the 14 NO terminal and tighten it down. Giving it a tug once again to make sure it's nice and tight and secure. Tuck these wires down in the side right here. Get them out of the way. Okay. Only got 2 wires left. That's the pump power L1 red and the pump power L2. As we saw earlier when we were going over the overview portion, the L2 wire ties directly into the A1 terminal of the contactor. Black L2 into A1. A little tug. Red L1 goes into 1L1. A little tug. All right. As you notice, I was kind of bundling these wires up and trying to keep them nice and neat, so I'm going to do one more step. And I'm going to add a wire tie here to these pump cable wires, just to try to keep them nice and neat and bundled up before I reinstall the control cover. Now that I've got the wires nice and tied and bundled up and all secured in the proper location, I'll make sure I don't forget to put my wiring diagram back into the control compartment before I reinstall the cover. We'll slide that in there. That. Flip the cover over. Make sure the wires are out of the way and that they're not going to get pinched between the two castings. Slide it over and line up the guide pin and squeeze the two castings together. Okay. At this point, I'm going to reinstall the 3 bolts that secure the control cover to the motor casting. And I'm going to use new nylock nuts to secure the bolts. Sometimes you need to put a little nickel anti-seize on these bolts, especially if you're using power tools or pneumatic tools and it spins fast. It's a lubricant to keep the stainless bolts and the stainless nuts from galling up and fusing together. These bolts already had some of that on there from the previous disassembly, so there's no need for me to add any additional at this time. Once the nuts are on there and they're hand started, you can go ahead and tighten them up with a 1/2 inch socket, ratchet, and wrench. Once the control cover has been secured to the motor compartment, there's one last thing we need to do before we replace the air release plug, and that is to air test the compartment, make sure that we don't have any leaks around the joints between the two castings or the split nut at the cable entry area. So I'm going to take my 1/8 inch NPT 3/16 barb fitting. I'm going to thread it into the air release hole. Attach my tubing, my hand pump, and pump the compartment up to 5 psi. Okay, once we're at 5 psi, I'm just going to spray the soapy water or leak detector around the cable entry area. And there again around the 2 halves or the 2 joints, or excuse me, the 1 joint where the 2 castings come together. If small leaks are noted, it'll usually be foaming up. If there's large leaks, you'll notice it right away because you'll have very large bubbles. There don't appear to be any leaks, so I'll remove the air test fixture and reinstall the air release plug. I'm going to be applying Loctite 598 to this area, so I may want to dry up any of that soapy water just to make sure that it adheres good to the casting. At this point, I take my 1/8 inch NPT plug, put it onto the end of my 3/16 hex key, and I apply Loctite 598 generously to the threads. Just like the cable entry area, don't be afraid to get too much. We want to make sure that the threads are evenly and fully coated, and once we install the plug, we're actually going to smear any residual across the top of it to completely seal that area. Just tighten it up good and snug. Actually, I'm going to take the excess that's sticking to the end of this hex key, smear it over the top of that. Make sure that it's evenly coated and completely covered. Once the air release plug has been reinstalled and sealed, we can now reinstall the level sensor assembly to the pump. As in the removal, we just want to spread the columns apart a little bit, kind of slide it over and straddle the pump as we lower it down. Okay. We're going to make sure that we secure it with the clips on either side. Okay. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this cable and just kind of double it over and bundle it up. There again, we're doing this for the removal and installation of the top housing. If we don't do that, it will interfere with the bottom portion of the top housing, so it's extremely important that we bundle this up to keep it out of the way. At this point, we're now ready to reinstall the top housing and the EQD and the insert.